I wrote a book called Explanations and Corrections in the Gospel of Luke, and in the last video I covered part of a chapter called Mark 13:4 and Matthew 24:16 are addressed to unbelievers, but I couldn't cover it all in that video. I think I called that episode number 16. So I'll describe the grammatical aspect of that of the chapter of third-party exhortations now, and I'll start with a section called Judea and Jerusalem should be understood literally, without qualification, without sub out an imagined ellipsis, in Mark 13:14 and Luke 21:20 through 21. To sub out an imagined ellipsis means that you imagine that something should be there and was left out, so you supply it. As I read, what I mean will become clear. The clauses below were explanatory comments added by Luke to explain the original meaning of the statement from Mark, which he had just quoted. That is, to explain, "Let them that are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them that are in the midst of her depart out, and let not them that are in the country enter therein." The pronoun her refers to Jerusalem in verse 20, not to Judea. Luke said that Jerusalem was going to be besieged. Them that are in the country means the Judeans of verse 21, who would normally enter Jerusalem for safety when foreign armies threatened. No more meaning should be interjected, not those Christians who were in Jerusalem, but those who were in Jerusalem, not those Christians who were in Judea, but those who were in Judea, not those Christians who were in the country, but those who were in the country. This was an exhortation for all Jerusalemites and all Judeans to flee, because neither the walls of Jerusalem nor God would protect them from the siege. They aren't given the hope of angelic deliverance by the Son of Man like the Christians in Luke 17. The exhortation was not addressed to the Christians of Jerusalem any more than the prophecies against Jerusalem in Luke 19:41 through 44 and 23:28 through 30. If Jesus' command about fleeing to the mountains ever had any additional meaning, like fleeing to Pella, Luke would have explained it. The clauses about fleeing to the mountains, fleeing from the midst of Jerusalem, and not entering into Jerusalem are nearly synonymous. They all mean Jerusalem is doomed, so get out. And fleeing to the mountains may be a figure of speech like the words of Luke 23:30. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. I don't know if that is the case, but if so, it's a mistake to try to identify the mountains Jesus was speaking about. The clause about fleeing to the mountains was in the imperative mood in Greek and is hard to translate into English. Jesus gave his end times discourse to 4 apostles, according to Mark 13:3. In Mark 13:14, Jesus says to those 4, "Let them that are in Judea flee to the mountains." What is the sense of the verb? The words could be construed incorrectly in English. The English reader shouldn't imagine that the word let is a synonym for permit. That is, Jesus was not saying, Peter, James, John, Andrew, when that time comes, I insist that the 4 of you permit the Judean Christians under your oversight to flee to the mountains. Also, the Greek verb is in the third person, not in the second person, as it would have been if spoken as a command to the four apostles. Third person exhortations are confusing. They don't seem to make sense. How can you exhort somebody who isn't present? Because of the importance of Luke 21:21, I have to digress. I don't know much Greek grammar, so I will rely mainly on English Bible translations from Greek, on context, on the testimony of John Chrysostom, and on public domain conjugations of Greek verbs. And I'm not going to cover this paragraph, which might be over-explaining the issue, because the fundamentals are very simple. When you read Luke 21, keep straight what's in the second person and what's in the third person. And if you're ever confused what the third person imperative or adjussive exhortation, what the meaning is, then read over other passages in Luke that have the same construction, and I'm going to mention those passages very soon. It's not necessary to study Greek grammars to understand the passages under discussion. Luke used the third person imperative enough for the English reader to understand the meaning from the context of his gospel. I will cover this later. Bible verses with third person commands are usually translated with a formula of words like let him plus the verb. This formula has been usually used for English translations from both Greek and Latin grammars usually use that formula. I don't know the history of that usage in English. Some translations of Luke 21:21 say he must instead of let him. Maybe the translators regarded let him as archaic or as not even a true imperative. Luke 21:21 has three third person imperatives. The person of the verb is important because it shows that the commands weren't directed to the apostles who heard Jesus. Yet some translations insert the word you as if they were. That is wrong and hides the important fact that second person verbs are missing in Luke 21:21 through 27, being replaced by third person verbs. I will later show that Chrysostom would object to those translations. I think that a translator is justified in changing let him to he must because it doesn't change the meaning much if at all. The translator in this case keeps close to the original by using a third person verb with a helping verb to make the verb imperative. Adam Clarke thought that Matthew 24:16, which corresponds to Mark 13:14, was Jesus' counsel to his followers. He wrote, "This counsel was remembered and wisely followed by the Christians afterwards." In comments on Matthew 24:20, he called it an order. Our Lord had ordered his followers to make their escape from Jerusalem when they should see it encompassed with armies. He and others have thought that Luke 21:21 meant then those future Christians who were in Judea must flee to the mountains. At least three modern translators incorrectly paraphrase Luke 21:21 in the second person, something like this: if you were a Christian in Judea at that time, flee to the mountains. This kind of paraphrase perpetuates the wrong interpretation of the verse that has prevailed since at least Augustine. And I quoted from Augustine in the last episode how he was all confused about this verse, saying he can understand how the apostles could see the Roman armies circling Jerusalem, but how did they get out once they were encompassed in? Verses 33 through 37 of Luke 23 show the meaning of the third person command. Luke 23:37 says that the soldiers mocked Jesus, saying, according to the Douay, "If thou be the king of the Jews, save thyself." In verse 39, one of the robbers said, "If thou be Christ, save thyself and us." The word save in both verses 37 and 39 is in the second person imperative, and they are translated into English in the imperative mood. Even though English doesn't have distinctive imperative conjugations, we recognize imperative verbs without any trouble from sentence structure. Luke 23:35 Douay says, "And the people stood beholden, and the rulers with them derided him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself." That's third person imperative. "If he be the Christ, the chosen of God." People are talking about Jesus in verse 35, not to him like in the other two verses. So the person of the verb changes from second person to third person. Oddly, the people who are talking about Jesus are also talking to him according to the imperative mood of the verb. It seems strange to us that a third person verb could be imperative, and it seems strange to ancient Latin translators, so they use the third person subjunctive. The logical basis for using the imperative in Greek must be that the people say about Jesus in the third person what they would have said to him in the second person if they had been in his presence. In Greek, these verbs are all imperative. Nearly all translations read, "let him save himself," or something very similar. A translation could read, "he must" or "he has to save himself," since the helping verb must imitates the imperative mood. And I don't, I only superficially know Greek, so I'll attempt to read these Greek verbs phonetically. According to online sources, the three Greek verbs in Luke 21:21, phelgetosan, flee, ekoretosan, depart out, and eis erkestosan, enter into, are all third person imperative verbs, just like Luke 23:35, which I mentioned above. Just as the rulers were talking about Jesus in Luke 23:35, not to him, so also in Luke 21:21, Jesus is talking about certain people in Judea, not to them. Luke 23:27 through 30 is about the siege of Jerusalem and alludes to Luke 21. Luke 23:28 reads in the Douay, "But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep, weep, not over me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." The word weep is second person imperative like Luke 23:37 and 39, but the verb is plural in this case. If Jesus had been talking about them instead of to them, he would have used the third person and said something like, "Let the daughters of Jerusalem weep for themselves and for their children," or "they must weep for themselves and for their children." Luke 23:27 through 30 alludes to the siege of Jerusalem by referring to future great suffering for women and children, and also by mentioning the hills. Compare Luke 21:20 through 24. Jesus spoke directly to Judean women who were going to suffer the vengeance of God in Luke 23 using the second person imperative. He spoke about them in Luke 21, but using a woe clause instead of an imperative. And I said in a footnote, Jesus addressed those women in the third person, but with a woe unto them clause instead of an imperative exhortation in Luke 21:23. Woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. Luke could have said, "Let them that are with child and that give suck in those days weep." That would correspond with what he said in the imperative to the women in Luke 23:28. Another interesting example is in Luke 16, where Abraham tells the rich man that his brethren should read Moses and the prophets. The rich man was separated from his brethren by an enormous distance since he was in Hades. I think that the verse is similar to Luke 21, where Jesus tells some apostles that certain people should flee, even though Jesus was separated from the people he was exhorting by distance and by decades of time. But I've run out of time for this episode, and so I won't read it. But just remember to read real translations and not paraphrases of Luke 21.